And so I will bid you all good afternoon and welcome you to the Spotlight Forum of the Democrats on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Today's gathering is entitled Toxic Priorities. Our purpose is to show how the devastating cuts and rollbacks at EPA will hit home to Americans. I deeply appreciate the witnesses here today. After the gaslighting we witnessed earlier today from Administrator Zeldin, we hope this will be a breath of fresh air. Administrator Zeldin and his Trump cronies can try to spin things all they like, but they cannot escape two facts. One, EPA has been a net positive force in America, delivering clean air, clean water, measurable health benefits, and economic growth for 50 years. Two, the budget EPA proposes, on top of the mischief already done to drive out the experts, freeze funding to communities, and unwind decades of environmental progress, abandons everyday Americans and caters to the planet's biggest polluters, who are also America's biggest political funders. In the President's proposed EPA budget, the narrative accompanying the huge cuts to funding for state programs called this funding a crutch and observed that states should figure it out for themselves. In other words, states are on their own. By dismantling science at EPA and undermining real reliance on risk assessments, the message is clear. We don't need health studies or research into the risks posed by chemicals. In other words, families are on their own. We've seen that grants authorized and appropriated by Congress and already obligated get canceled if Administrator Zeldin or President Trump don't like them. In other words, communities are on their own. This is not governing. This is not protecting clean air and clean water, as Administrator Zeldin and President Trump pretended on multiple occasions. This is not even making America healthy again. This is polluter-driven lawlessness, with chaos layered on to mask the lawlessness. Administrator Zeldin is dismantling services that deliver for the American people. He's acting against the law, against the Constitution, and against the values of the American people to deliver a crippled EPA that cannot check corporate polluters, many of whom also happen to be among President Trump's biggest donors. This afternoon, we'll hear from witnesses who called on the EPA for help and had the EPA answer, providing emergency response services after a horrible train derailment, enforcement actions against giant corporations polluting our air and water, funding and technical assistance for states, cities, and communities as they implement important pollution control programs, and unbiased science that we can trust was not bought and paid for by the chemical industry. These witnesses will tell you what their communities would look like without a functioning EPA, and what America will look like without an EPA that works to protect people, communities, and our beleaguered planet. Americans deserve an EPA that will show up for them, but that is not Zeldin's EPA. Zeldin's EPA is a 55% budget cut, with the deepest cuts for funding that goes to states and communities to help them ensure that people can breathe clean air and drink clean water. At the same time, states will be called on to do more because EPA has stopped collecting pollution data, halted critical health research, rolled back air and water standards, and refused to enforce the law against entire industries. States are reporting that EPA regions are calling them, begging them to submit draft permits and air plans before the last expert in the building retires or is forced out. This morning, what did Administrator Zeldin claim was the reason for his total abdication of his responsibility to the American people? He claimed he is on the hunt for waste, fraud, and abuse. Earlier today, I spoke about the lengths Administrator Zeldin and his DOJ partners in crime have gone to gaslight the American people. They have made baseless fraud claims to try and cancel $20 billion in congressionally authorized money-saving investments in flood prevention projects, tribal clean energy programs, and Habitat for Humanity as it rebuilds homes destroyed by flood or fire. Clearly, when you see Habitat for Humanity involved, you've got to look for crime somewhere. You'll notice that in his hearing today, Administrator Zeldin only referred to waste and abuse. The word fraud has fallen out of his lexicon, perhaps because his own lawyers in court have denied that there is any fraud or criminality going on, and that EPA is not even properly alleging that that is the case. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund debacle is outrageous in its scope and its prosecutorial misconduct, but is by no means an outlier for the Trump regime. Listen to the stories today and ask yourself if any of this sounds like waste, fraud, or abuse. The community in East Palestine looking for answers after a Norfolk Southern train derailed and caught fire in their town. Communities across the United States wanting to replace aging water systems and ensure delivery of clean drinking water. Residents living in the shadow of a chemical plant wanting cleaner air and proper information about the quality of their air. A scientist who has devoted her life to protecting maternal and child health. If Zeldin and his Trumpy minions want to find waste, fraud, and abuse, they should go look in the mirror. Zeldin's EPA is selling out our public health and our environment to the highest polluter bidder. Today's witnesses are here to remind everyone of EPA's mission and its important work, lowering energy costs for families, expanding access to clean air and clean water, and yes, holding polluters accountable. We begin today with someone who has stood in Administrator Zeldin's shoes, serving as Administrator of EPA in a Republican administration. The difference is that Administrator Riley served with integrity and distinction. Under Mr. Riley's leadership, from 1989 to 1983, EPA implemented the ambitious Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which go back to work by Senator John Chafee of Rhode Island, as the administrator will recall. When EPA followed congressional directives, both reversing the devastating effects of acid rain and shrinking the hole in the ozone layer. Under Mr. Riley's leadership, EPA expanded its support for America's great waters, including Chesapeake Bay. I'm also told that during Mr. Riley's tenure, EPA completed a Superfund cleanup every 5 days, a record we'd love to see repeated. Mr. Riley has served as president and later chairman of the board of the World Wildlife Fund, president of the Conservation Foundation, and co-chair of the President's Commission on Deepwater Horizon, the Gulf explosion. Earlier in his career, Mr. Riley served in the United States Army as a captain. Mr. Riley, please come forward. We appreciate you joining us today and sharing your expertise on EPA's importance, EPA's track record, and the threats EPA faces today. Welcome, sir. Is the mic on?
Talk.
That helps
Appreciate
with TV folks.
the invitation to offer my viewpoint of current proposals regarding EPA's budget and programs. In the 55 years since EPA was founded by President Nixon, it has been the principal driver of the environmental transformation of the United States. Its record is one of steady and measurable achievement. And we know this because EPA's benefits have been extensively monitored and measured, perhaps more than those of any other agency. Between 1980 and 2017, one piece of the last 55 years, data show airborne lead down 99%. Nitrogen oxide down 63%. Sulfur dioxide down 90%. Remember acid rain. SO2 and emissions of particulates in the Grand Canyon were impeding visibility as late as 1992. Those emissions are down 90%. Because of EPA, visitors to the Grand Canyon can see farther during daylight and can see more stars in the night sky. Americans appreciate EPA, and large majorities of Democrats and Republicans support strong air and water quality laws, and many support strengthening them. As President George H.W. Bush's chief pollster, Bob Teeter, said, belief in an improving environment has entered the DNA of the American people. Polling, even since the last election, reflects that. So EPA has been an effective regulator. It has also been an imaginative designer of voluntary programs. Energy Star is an initiative which provides energy-efficient options to builders, home buyers, and buyers of appliances. It has saved upwards of $200 billion by prescribing efficient design features in buildings, homes, air conditioners, computers, refrigerators, stoves, heating, instruments, and the rest. The real estate industry values very highly the Energy Star on buildings and highlights the award in marketing. Bosch, Carrier, and appliance manufacturers value the steady improvements the award has encouraged. The pollution related to energy that Energy Star has saved is equivalent to taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Rarely have I seen such unanimity between environmentalists and the real estate sector. It costs $32 million per year, and it's being terminated by the administration. Good. Over the years, EPA has identified principal pollution sources in Chesapeake Bay and other iconic waterways. EPA has then deployed multiple strategies to address that pollution. I and other EPA administrators, beginning with Bill Ruckelshaus, the first EPA administrator, have given a high priority to improving the clarity, the seagrasses, and fish habitats in the bay. EPA has documented steady improvements. 5 states and District of Columbia have fashioned an equivalent program of their own without EPA data and investments in wastewater cleanup. I doubt it. More likely, they would have engaged in disputes about which state bore more responsibility for particular pollution. And here, too, EPA has detected measurable progress in the health of this beautiful body of water. Under the proposed EPA budget, funding to states for clean water and drinking water are being eliminated. I remind you that the essential rationale between the establishment of EPA was the failure of many states to clean up their environments and to prevent states competing for industry relaxing regulations. The termination of the Office of Environmental Justice, which I initiated at EPA, will reduce efforts to address the health of people suffering most from gastrointestinal illness in areas of limited sanitation like Native American reservations and the colonias along the U.S.-Mexican border. Over the years I was in office, I have been invited to recommend environmental policies in other countries, such as Ireland, Turkey, and China. Chinese regulators modeled their 1,000 Clean Building campaign on the U.S. EPA's 3350 Toxics Reduction Program and on the Energy Star program. And the program in China worked where regulations were resisted. Environmental law enforcers in other countries recognize the U.S. EPA as exemplary, the gold standard. As the writer Greg Easterbrook has written, the environment is one of the 2 greatest achievements of public social policy in the post-World War II period. The principal driver of that success has been the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Administrator Riley. We have been joined by the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, and I'd like to, before we get into any questions, invite him to make some comments, and I'm grateful to him for being here. We have a floor battle going on right now related to California's clean air standards.
Right.
And it is complex and kind of, as sometimes happens in the Senate, a knife fight under the covers. It's hard to appreciate unless you're in the knife fight. And the leader has been a really staunch ally in that fight, and I turn to him with
You will not
pride.
be surprised. I'm a believer in the waiver program, not just because I'm from California, but I granted 9 waivers when I was in office.
Well, thank you. Thank you, as they used to call you, Billy Riley. And thank you for your leadership and for being here. I'll be brief. I promised Sheldon I would come. But as he said, we got a lot of things going on the floor. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank our other witnesses. I guess they're sitting in the, Robert Taylor, Misty Allison. Thank you for being here as well. You know, Lee Zeldin, when he met me, he said he was going to fight for keeping our air clean, our water clean, that he's going to keep the EPA intact, more or less. Well, they want to slash EPA's budget by 55%. And 55% is not, it's not 55%. When you cut an agency by that much, the remaining 45% have a very difficult time functioning. So in a sense, he wants to get rid of the whole Environmental Protection Agency and how it functions. It is disgraceful. It is so disgraceful. And more people will be sick, more people will die, people will live less long, all because of these cuts. And why are these cuts coming about? The bottom line is that the Republican leadership is in the throes of the oil and gas industry, plain and simple. And anything that's on the other side of that, when oil and gas and everything else are far more polluting in our air and our water, they need to defend it, but they don't just need to defend it. What they do is they slash anything else. So with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I was proud to lead, where we did the greatest additions to, in terms of tax breaks, to clean air and clean water, to clean energy, they want to get rid of it, or basically get rid of it. When it comes to anything that makes our environment cleaner, the fanaticism of the hard right in the oil and gas industry just says cut anything else because it speaks badly of oil, gas, and coal. And of course, that's because of their polluting effects. One of the things that's and it's affecting people's costs. Everyone cares about costs. This is going to make people's much more people's their costs are going to go way up. Their energy bills are going to go up. The cost of owning a home is going to go up. Sheldon has led the charge on this. Insurance rates are skyrocketing throughout large parts of America, particularly coastal America. So much so that many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or maybe probably millions, can't sell their homes because there's no one to buy it. And new young people who want to buy a home can't buy a home because they can't get insurance, or because the insurance is so expensive because of all the changes that global warming has occurred that EPA is contributing to reducing. So this is a disgrace, what Mr. Zeldin is doing. I came here to assure the audience here and those listening home that we are going to do everything we can, both to fight these cuts and to preserve our environment, to keep our water clean, to keep our air clean, to make sure that clean energy across the board is available to people because it's cheaper as well as much better for our globe. So I thank you for being here, Mr. Riley. I'm sorry I'll be brief. I had more to say, but I want to thank Sheldon. He's been a tremendous leader on this issue, and thank our witnesses for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader Schumer. I'm grateful to you for being here. Before I let you go, Administrator Riley,
Thank you, Senator.
I want to discuss with you the EPA workforce. The EPA workforce is described by the partisans of the fossil fuel industry as unaccountable bureaucrats, as people who interfere in the economic growth of the United States of America, as essentially evildoers. And one of the agents of the polluter industrial complex and its political operation is an individual named Russell Vogt, who is now the director of the Office of Management and Budget. In effect, the fossil fuel industry is running the U.S. government from the inside through infiltration of individuals like Russell Vogt. Russell Vogt has said that he wants to see public employees traumatized, embarrassed to come to work, ashamed, and has developed the tool of traumatizing, his word, workers as a way to drive them out of the offices that they work in so that the offices are damaged, incapacitated, unable to go after polluters. And he specifically focused in the entire federal workforce. He was happy to traumatize pretty much everybody, but he really wanted to traumatize the workers at EPA. You ran EPA, you've stayed in touch with EPA, you have friends in EPA. Describe who comes to EPA and why, and whether or not they're the type of individual who deserves to be traumatized by people like Russell Vogt.
You know, Senator, before I went to EPA, but after I was announced as someone about to be appointed, I encountered an AP reporter named Durst, and he said, "You're going to the best agency." And I said, "That's not the general impression in the environmental community from which I came. Our view was with EPA was a little slow and sometimes fearful to act." I then found out myself, after extensive involvement with people there, that something that is well known throughout the executive branch, that probably the most sophisticated energy or sophisticated department in the government at risk analysis, risk assessment, economic consequences of pollution control, all of the very sophisticated subjects which EPA has to make decisions on regularly. No one does it better than EPA. And they are a very devoted force. I remember learning that we had more ex-Peace Corps employees than any other agency by far. Well, people don't go in the Peace Corps to burnish their CV or to make money. They happen to be committed. And I remember, I'll tell you a story about the Interior Secretary once. I asked him how he was doing, how he liked his job, Manuel Lujan, and he said, "Well, it's terrific. I didn't have anything to do when I was in the minority in the Interior Committee." And he said, "But I know that when the Bureau of Mines or Reclamation gets an order, they salute and they carry it out." He said, "Parks and Fish and Wildlife, they have to check with God first." And then he stopped and he said, "I forgot who I was talking to. That's all you've got is people who check with God." And that's generally, basically the idea. They are committed force. You don't go there if you're not committed to the environment.
One more question, then I'll turn to Senator Blunt Rochester, who I'm glad has joined us to have our conversation with former Administrator Riley. Vehicle emission standards we're fighting over right now on the Senate floor. They're ready to overrule the parliamentarian, to go nuclear, to blow up California's clean emissions waiver, which Rhode Island and other states follow. Even though those standards reduce costs for consumers, reduce fuel costs, energy-efficient cars, fuel-efficient cars do well for consumers. And the home appliance parallels the Energy Star program that also helps reduce costs for consumers, reduce electric bills, while also providing health and safety benefits. What on earth can the logic be behind trying to undo those things other than to help power plants produce more coal-fired, oil-fired, gas-fired power, and the gasoline industry sell more gasoline. Who's hurt by those programs?
One explanation for the position to terminate Energy Star was that it's part of a program within the agency that's concerned with climate. Well, that's a misunderstanding. I think it never was. It was always conceived as an enterprise to save consumers money and improve their efficiency and also save the pollution associated with saved energy. As far as the waiver is concerned, it has a distinguished history. The reason for it is California had the most egregious pollution problem. It also was the most resourceful and imaginative in addressing that problem, and addressing it in ways that were sometimes innovative and experiment. I remember signing one waiver and saying specifically that we at EPA did not believe it would work. They were going to require 10% of all cars to be electric vehicles. You can't really control a market where the people aren't ready for it, and they weren't. But we thought they had a right to try, and that's how most of our environmental laws originated. And I think Wisconsin was the first to do wetlands protection and so forth. It is, I think, a very important part of the law. It has led to enormous creativity and has pushed clean air standards that apply nationally to get even more stringent, more effective. So it doesn't make sense to get rid of it. And it will set back, I think, some of the most progressive initiatives around.
Let me turn to Senator Blunt Rochester for a question, and then, Mr. Administrator, we'll let you go on to your busy day. Thank you very much for being here, and after that, we'll recognize the other witnesses to come
Thank
forward
you, Senator.
and take their seats. Senator Blunt Rochester.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Whitehouse, especially for holding this spotlight hearing. I think after earlier today, it is good to really shine a light on the impacts that we're seeing from this current administration on our health and our environment. And so, Commissioner, I thank you for being here. And I had an interesting conversation with Administrator Zeldin in our committee earlier today. He told me that he believes people do, in fact, have a right to live in an environment free from harmful pollutants. He also said he believes that giving people access to accurate air toxic measurements protects human health, a key part of the EPA's mission. Yet Zeldin's EPA has shuttered a grant that would help constituents in my home state of Delaware monitor and assess air toxics. This federal funding was crucial for ensuring residents knew when to keep their doors shut or their windows, how to protect their families from harmful toxins. Yet, Mr. Zeldin cut the funding. So my first question to you is this. Can you explain how access to air toxic measurements empower communities?
Thank you, Senator. In my experience, the toxicity of laws is often ignored or unrecognized, particularly in areas where it's sometimes so concentrated that separating it out from other chemicals that are in the air is complex, scientifically difficult. What we have with toxics, I think, was, and the capacity we have to improve it, was demonstrated by something called the Toxics Release Inventory that was enacted in the late 80s and required no compulsory provisions, simply required every company to analyze, measure, and then report its toxics. And I remember early in my term at EPA, I had occasion to come to the Congress, and every office I was in, the headlines and the photographs were of buildings of companies in their jurisdictions of these members of Congress that had reported. And the most significant were noted and began almost immediately to reconsider their performance. And I remember the chairman of Monsanto saying, you know, before some of those requirements, we never knew the extent of what was going up our chimneys. So information is enormously powerful. Toxics information and toxics affects health in so many ways, and particularly vulnerable people, that we need more of it.
Thank you. I know I was really impressed because many communities in my state, this was an opportunity for them to have the information, share the information with their neighbors. It was, to me, a way to both be a partner with government and also with, surrounding the businesses and others to make sure that their health and their well-being was taken care of. And so do you believe that shuttering these grants helps to achieve EPA's mission? I think this is an easy one.
Absolutely not. And the really pernicious part of this is that they're not just relaxations of regulations and standards. There's withdrawal of information and the intention not to collect it any further. So we will have very little in the way of information if these changes go through to hold them accountable. And that's all clearly part of the effort.
I want to shift now to the Energy Star program. You were the administrator of the EPA when the Energy Star program was created, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
You recently published an op-ed in the Washington Post discussing why the Energy Star program is everything government should be, quote, and an example of democratic government at its best. Can you expand on this?
Well, if you are the EPA administrator, you are very accustomed to conflict and to conflicts between environmentalists and developers are classics. The Energy Star program has made environmentalists of real estate, the real estate sector. They love it. And I remember a major developer in California telling me, he said, the most successful and popular regulation you have is not even a regulation. It's Energy Star. He said, you cannot get financing if you're building in California, a significant building is not going to comply with Energy Star. So the mystery is, how is it that something is so universally popular, for which statistics show $200 billion of savings and a significant reduction in pollution, how that can be positive, how that can be something anybody's willing to defend? I have not been able to identify, I tried to before that I published that op-ed, who was responsible for this decision? Did it come out of OMB, the White House, or Zeldin himself? Because it makes no sense. It has been attributed to the fact that the program is assumed to be a climate program. Well, it never was that, so it's a mistaken identity if it's being stricken for that. But it's utterly unconscionable to take something that is a model of good government and trash it.
So this administration says that they have a major focus on energy supply. Can you share how the Energy Star program supports the U.S. energy supply?
Well, it's pretty clear that the savings I mentioned, the $200 billion and $14 billion in 2024 alone, saved a great deal of energy at a time when we're beginning to go into a phase of a shortage of energy, when energy is scarce, having been steady in demand for many years, is not remaining so, and is expected to result with the data centers and everything else in a much greater need. You need things like Energy Star in that circumstance.
Right. And lastly, some critics of the program note that it should be a nonprofit and separate from government. What are your thoughts on this?
Honestly, the fact that it is part of government, that it's part of EPA, enhances its attractiveness, reassures people who participate in it that it's on the level and that will be done with trust and integrity. That's what it means. I don't know who else could have the kind of trust and respect. I hope, I will say, I hope that after a year of these kinds of reforms, the government still is trusted and still performs in a way that deserves that trust.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your service. I think about the fact that in a time where people are even struggling to pay their bills, you're looking for energy efficiency, you're looking for things that really help the American people. And this program, as you said, historically has been bipartisan. It's a win-win, and I want to thank you so much for your service, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Ranking Member Whitehouse, for this opportunity to shine a light on what's actually happening in this country.
Thank you, Senator.
And thank you, Administrator Riley.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
You are excused. Thank you so much. I will ask the other witnesses to come up and to have the names put forward. While they're organizing that, I'll make the introductions. Our first witness is Misty Allison. Ms. Allison is a mother of two and a resident of East Palestine, Ohio, where on February 3rd, 2023, a Norfolk Southern train derailed, releasing approximately 1.1 million pounds of vinyl chloride into the air, soil, and water. Ms. Allison holds a Master of Public Health and Bachelor of Health Sciences and previously worked at Cleveland Clinic, Susan G. Komen, and the American Cancer Society. The impact that this disaster had on her community inspired her to run for mayor, volunteer with Moms Clean Air Force, and become the Community Advisory Board Chair for the East Palestine Train Derailment Health Tracking Study through the University of Kentucky. Next will be Mr. Robert Taylor. Bobby Taylor is a native of Reserve, Louisiana. He's the founder and executive director of the Concerned Citizens of St. John, Incorporated. In 2016, EPA came to Reserve to warn his community that they had the highest risk of cancer in the USA due to emissions of chloroprene from the DuPont Denka facility. His small group of red shirt-wearing concerned citizens have made a great difference in St. John the Baptist Parish and brought worldwide attention to Cancer Alley and environmental racism. Mr. Taylor traveled with the Poor People's Campaign, testified before the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the United Nations, and spoke at Administrator Regan's official signing of the HON Toxic Air Rule in Washington, D.C. This is one of the rules that Zeldin's EPA is handing out waivers for, so that polluters get to not comply with the new standards. Our third witness is Dr. Tracy Woodruff. Dr. Woodruff is an endowed professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at UCSF and the director of the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment. She holds a PhD in bioengineering from a joint program between UC Berkeley and UCSF and a master's in public health from UC Berkeley. She's an expert on environmental pollution exposures and impacts on health with a focus on pregnancy, infancy, and childhood. Before joining UCSF, Dr. Woodruff was a senior scientist and policy advisor for, guess what, the US EPA's Office of Policy. And last, but certainly not least, we welcome Keith McLaughlin, Executive Director of the Colorado Water and Power Authority and Secretary of CIFA, the Council for Infrastructure Financing Associations. Keith has been with the authority for over 25 years and is responsible for managing 5 water programs that deliver nearly $3.4 billion in water infrastructure projects to Colorado municipalities and special districts. Keith is also a board member for the Colorado Water Congress. I'll call the witnesses in that order. So, Ms. Allison, the floor is yours.
I'm just waiting for my
I think it's on.
my clock to start.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm a rule follower, so wanted to make sure I was doing this in my 5-minute time frame. So thank you for the opportunity to put a face on environmental disasters and to advocate for a fully funded and effectively structured environmental protection agency. The photographs on exhibit are just a few of thousands that were taken by photojournalist Rebecca Kiger, who spent a year in East Palestine after our disaster. These images are a powerful reminder that this is a human issue that transcends politics, one that should spark meaningful change, not the kind of change that puts more lives at risk by cutting critical funding. Over 2 years ago, a Norfolk Southern train carrying toxic chemicals derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, unleashing devastating consequences for my family and our small town, with pollution even spreading to 16 states and parts of Canada. The night I saw the massive fireball from my driveway after putting my 2 small kids to bed felt like an apocalyptic nightmare. The derailment and chemical fire burned for days. Then, Norfolk Southern and its contractors withheld crucial information, leading Incident Command to make the unnecessary decision to drain and burn 1.1 million pounds of vinyl chloride, a known human carcinogen. The resulting ominous black cloud over Ohio and Pennsylvania was terrifying. Many residents quickly began experiencing headaches, nosebleeds, skin rashes, and breathing problems. These health issues still haven't gone away, and some in our community are still suffering. This incident underscores the role the EPA plays in responding to disasters that have lasting impacts on public health, the economy, transportation systems, and daily life. When polluters are not held accountable, our nation pays the price. The EPA is one of the few remaining checks and balances on corporate power, and its ability to act swiftly and with authority is vital. The EPA's comprehensive and rapid response in East Palestine helped ensure that Norfolk Southern followed federal regulations and that cleanup at the disaster site moved forward. Was the EPA's response perfect? No, absolutely not. But without the agency's oversight, would Norfolk Southern have prioritized cost savings over public health and environmental safety? Sadly, I believe that answer is yes. The EPA have held Norfolk Southern accountable for their actions, leveraging every enforcement tool available under their purview. The EPA directed extensive cleanup in East Palestine and coordinated with federal, state, and local partners to help restore my community. This includes removing over 224,000 tons of contaminated soil, 74 million gallons of wastewater, and collecting over 115 million air monitoring data points. The EPA also served as a supportive advocate for the community, ensuring our concerns were heard. They served more than 1,200 visitors at their Welcome Center and organized a cross-functional community group that provided robust updates. Over the past 2 years, I've had many conversations with members of the EPA field team. They are consistently supportive, transparent, and committed. Many spent more time stationed in East Palestine during the first year of cleanup than with their own families, demonstrating a deep sense of duty to the people they serve. The East Palestine train derailment is just one example of the many environmental and human health disasters the EPA handles each year, from hurricanes and floods to chemical spills and oil leaks. In 2022 alone, the EPA supported local response efforts after 20 major storms. With petrochemical incidents now occurring every 3 days, the EPA responds to an average of 1,000 chemical spills annually. And since the 1970s, the agency has been involved in more than 50,000 oil spill cleanups, protecting waterways and ecosystems. How is the EPA expected to effectively operate with less? The EPA's disaster response relies on adequate funding and specialized resources. Budget cuts will lead to slower mobilization, less effective assessments, and enforcement bottlenecks. Reduced monitoring and testing will result in less accurate data, exposing Americans to unknown risks. Inadequate cleanup efforts will leave communities with long-term health and economic issues. Without funding for community education and science initiatives, residents will lack the knowledge and tools to protect their health and environment. On February 3rd, 2023, it was my town, but it could be yours next. If the EPA is not fully funded, who will be there to support your community and your families when disaster strikes? Cutting the budget for these critical services is short-sighted and dangerous. The United States spares no expense in protecting American citizens from external threats. Shouldn't we apply the same level of commitment to defending against the harmful chemicals released by domestic tragedies? As I conclude, I hope these photos leave a lasting impression of the people in and around East Palestine who were harmed and the public servants who showed up to help. These photos may not be lab reports or charts, but they capture the raw, unfiltered emotional data that is essential to understanding the true impact of disaster. The EPA saw this pain and resilience firsthand, day after day, as they worked tirelessly on the ground in the impacted communities of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Each image tells a story of lives disrupted and families struggling, reminding us that behind every statistic is a human face. What you decide matters. So I urge you, honorable senators, to hold yourselves and your colleagues accountable for ensuring the EPA has the necessary budget and structure to protect our environment and communities, because the health and safety of our nation depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allison. Before I let you go, let me call attention to your Mom's Clean Air Force badge. Bravo. And now, Mr. Taylor, we turn to you for your statement. Welcome.
My name is Robert Taylor. I was born in and lived my whole life in Missouri, Louisiana.
Let me check and see if your mic is on, Mr. Taylor. You may want to pull it in a little bit. There you go.
My name is Robert Taylor.
Yes, sir.
I was born and all my life in St. John Parish, Louisiana, in a town called Missouri. I built my current home and have lived there until Hurricane Ida was destroyed. In the 1970s and 80s, I started realizing that something was wrong. Something unnatural was going on. After neoprene production facility moved in, the children started saying that they couldn't play outside because they had trouble breathing. Certain vegetation started dying. Eventually, people in my community started getting sick and dying. I watched my family and community suffer from the same health issues: cancer, respiratory issues, and autoimmune disease. I have lost my mother, cousins, brother, my late wife, and multiple neighbors and friends to cancer. In 2016, EPA came to our community and reported that we in St. John, the Baptist parish, had the highest risk of cancer from toxic air pollution in the United States due to exposure from chloroquine emitted by a facility in our neighborhood called Denver. Now it is owned by the Japanese company Denver after being transferred from DuPont, who were the original polluters. EPA concluded that in order for chloroquine not to cause an unacceptable cancer risk to the community, levels of chloroquine should not be greater than 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter of air. EPA required fence line monitoring of chloroquine and made the emissions data available to the community. The numbers were egregious, sometimes over 700 times as much as the amount EPA concluded would cause unacceptable cancer risk. Our exposure to toxic air pollution, which compromises our community, our immune systems. So St. John the Baptist Parish suffered the highest per capita death rate from COVID-19 in the beginning of the pandemic. That is the highest death rate in the country. All I could think about was the years of watching my family and friends suffer from cancer and diseases, and how many of them I lost. And all of it could have been prevented if we were not being poisoned by the facility that we know as, I'm sorry. Over the past 8 years, We marched to the state capitol twice, traveled to Japan, met with local, state, and federal governmental officials. We sued EPA to issue overdue air traffic, filed a civil rights complaint with EPA, filed a petition with the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and spoke before the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Nothing happened until EPA stepped in and stepped up for our community. When the Biden administration took office, I was contacted by EPA and told that Administrator Reagan would visit our community. It was an honor to participate in the Journey to Justice tour. Administrator Reagan walked in the community and talked to members. He stood with us at Fifth Ward Elementary School and felt the urgency of regulating the toxic emissions to protect our children. EPA investigated the state of Louisiana for failing to protect us from air pollution and released a letter of concern. The letter validated everything that we have fought for over the past years. EPA concluded that Louisiana dismissed residents' concerns about air quality, underplayed the dangers of chloroquine, conducted flawed health studies, mischaracterized air monitoring data. It showed that the state was not advocating for clean air or the safety of the community, but for the petrochemical industry. EPA also issued the harm and polymer resin rule that would reduce the emissions of chloroquine from Denver as well as ethylene oxide from Ebola, another facility in the area. Administrator Reagan, a second time, announced the new rule, and I had the opportunity to speak at the announcement. The rule gave Denver 90 days to lower their emissions. The Department of Justice also filed a lawsuit against Denver for putting us in imminent danger. We finally felt represented. On December 31st, 2024, my wife passed away. From a 22-year battle with multiple illnesses. This, like many other deaths and illnesses in our community, is our normal way of life, which is not normal. Our neighbors and loved ones fight to survive. Every day we are battling a disease, taking care of loved ones, and our struggle with debilitating illnesses or burying their loved ones. This is not a life for hard-working, taxpaying human beings that live where the state of Louisiana designated a sacrifice zone. We are designated a sacrifice zone. We are dying every day. We are only as healthy as our next doctor's visit, and we hold our breath to hear our latest test results. To dismantle the only federal agency that was serving the purpose of protecting the environment and the people who live near the petrochemical industry would be a travesty. The Republican Party shut down the EPA's investigation into Louisiana state agencies and their failure to protect us. Now the EPA has set up a website for the petrochemical industry to request relief from their responsibilities set by the prior administration. Department of Justice has dropped a lawsuit against Danker, and now the EPA administrator wants to shut down the vital science and staff. The petrochemical industry will control the agency. We need the EPA to have enough resources and staff to do its job and protect us from pollution. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor, thank you very much. I've been down to visit cancer rally, and I appreciate very much your experience, and I offer you my condolences about your wife. Dr. Woodruff, and then Mr. McLaughlin, and in the meantime, we have been joined by the redoubtable, incomparable Ed Markey of Massachusetts.
But would you mind if I just asked a couple of questions, maybe?
Go for it.
Of Ms. Woodruff, and, because it's just a crazed traffic jam of
Sure,
Congress
go ahead.
right now today. So here's my question. In March, EPA launched a new polluter inbox, allowing operators of coal plants, operators of chemical manufacturing, other industrial polluters to request presidential exemptions from Clean Air Act limits on hazardous air pollutants linked to cancer, neurological damage, developmental harm, and reproductive toxicity. EPA is simply prioritizing polluters and rubber standing projects rather than protecting communities. I led a letter with Representative Cohen calling for EPA to publicly disclose who's applying and what standards they're trying to avoid. The public deserves to know. So, so what are the health harms that rules like the Clean Air Act are designed to protect, and what's at stake if these protections are waived and polluters are given a free pass?
Sure. So I just want to talk about how important the Clean Air Act has been in improving the public's health since its enactment in 1990. EPA has, under the Clean Air Act, done a benefit cost analysis of the health harms of both the what's known as criteria air pollutants, so particulate matter, air pollution standard, ozone, mentioned first in the hearing this morning, NOx, lead. Those all we know from EPA science and from EPA data on monitoring. EPA in the Clean Air Act requires that there's monitoring of these air pollutants. We know that those air pollutants can cause premature mortality. They can cause cardiovascular events. They can cause cancer. They also contribute to loss in IQ for young children. They also can cause reproductive health events like low birth weight and premature birth. So and they also can cause dementia. So there's probably no health outcome that is not touched by these air pollutions. I also want to say, also in the Clean Air Act, it covers what I was 188, but it's like 185 now, hazardous air pollutants, chloroprene, ethylene oxide, 1,3-butadiene, benzene, dioxin. These are all to be regulated under the Clean Air Act as well, and are really also can cause a whole range of adverse health effects, including reductions in fertility, cancer, which you've heard about. All the health effects that were mentioned by the previous panelists are health effects that have been known to be increased by exposure to those toxic hazardous air pollutants. And so I will talk about this some more, but by going after ORD that produces the science that allows us to know what those health effects are, you can essentially, or the goal, it seems like, is essentially make those health effects disappear and pretend that they don't even happen from the very polluting industries who are harming the public.
And I appreciate that. I introduced the first acid rain bill with Silvio Conti in 1981 to get it passed. And John Dingell was the chair of our committee, and he didn't have a high interest in legislating in that area. We actually held our press conference where each of us holding umbrellas with holes in them, showing how acid rain was eating through, all of the valuable things that we were trying to produce. And it was essentially, I hate to say this because that's how it used to be, a father in the front seat of the car smoking a cigar and blowing the smoke right back to the three kids sitting in the back seat, right? So that was just moving across states, and we were seeing the impacts in the eastern part of the United States. And that's where I got to meet Bill Riley as we were doing the 1990 Clean Air Act on the Energy and Commerce Committee. John Dingell sitting next to Henry Waxman, sitting next to Ed Markey on that committee. And just an absolute splendid job, and so good to see you again, Mr. Administrator. You were an historic leader in passing that bill. And I just want to thank all of you, especially those of you who live in the communities that are still adversely impacted by all of this unnecessary pollution that we send up into the atmosphere. And I thank you, Dr. Woodruff, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me just to interject here for a second. Thank you.
Always good to have you here. Eddie Markey has been doing environmental protection longer than anybody else in the Senate. And if we'd listened to him back with the original climate bill, we wouldn't be in this predicament right now. Dr. Woodruff, please go ahead with your statement.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about efforts to shut down EPA's Office of Research and Development, and with it, EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. So I'm Dr. Tracy Woodruff. I'm professor and director of the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment at the University of California, San Francisco. I previously served as a senior scientist in EPA's Office of Policy for over a decade, and I have extensive research experience on toxic chemicals and their health effects using science for evidence-based decision-making. Most people have not heard of ORD or IRIS, but these scientific EPA programs with highly trained and experienced scientists have extensive and far-reaching responsibilities that affect the health of every person in the U.S. The agency's research and research investments provide data to improve our understanding of the hazards and risks of chemicals people are exposed to every day in our air, water, and products we buy, and how they impact health and child development. For example, ORD scientists came up with the idea and developed methods to measure Gen X, which is a new PFAS chemical that was being discharged into North Carolina's Cape Fear River by a fluorochemical manufacturer. Gen X from the factory contaminated the local drinking water, and EPA helped state officials monitor and curb these PFAS releases. Without this landmark work by ORD scientists, people would be exposed to toxic Gen X and experience health harms without anyone knowing this toxic chemical was in their drinking water. As you have heard, ORD scientists also support emergency response disasters. When there's a toxic spill, so in the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, oil spill in the Louisiana Gulf Coast, EPA scientists monitor and evaluate risks to the community, guide mitigation, and work to ensure cleanups meet health standards. And in the face of climate-driven disasters such as the LA wildfires or toxic algae blooms on Florida's coastline, ORD provides critical and unique assistance to monitor air and water quality and support efforts to address these health and life-threatening incidences. And also, ORD works with the Department of Homeland Security to monitor cybersecurity vulnerabilities of our drinking water system from possible terrorist attack. ORD also provides critical research support via grants to universities that are trying to solve everyday problems. These grants have been terminated. I was part of a team with Johns Hopkins University to better understand how infants and children's unique behavior patterns increase their exposure to toxic chemicals and house dust, which is a critical need for EPA risk assessments. EPA's termination letter said, "This research does not meet agency priorities," without any further explanation. EPA has terminated at least 16 ORD grants evaluating PFAS and 12 on children's health without justification and contrary to its mission. EPA's ORD also houses the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, which is responsible for providing independent scientific assessments of the hazards and risks of toxic chemicals that serve as a scientific foundation for risk management actions like related to the Danka facility you just heard about. IRIS's analyses are used for hazardous waste cleanups, air quality standards, drinking water, and TSCA regulations. They are widely used both inside and outside of EPA, including by states, local agencies assessing chemical risks, and for cleaning up contaminated sites. IRIS toxicity values are an essential part of protecting health by reducing exposure to widespread toxic chemicals like arsenic and PFAS. And IRIS is in ORD to ensure that the science is kept separate from regulatory decisions making to minimize political or corporate pressure from influencing the outcomes. IRIS was started to ensure that chemicals of concern have a single EPA hazard assessment rather than multiple assessments by different EPA programs. IRIS assessments form the basis for EPA decisions such as 1,4-dioxane poses unreasonable health risks, and rules banning TCE, a solvent which increases the risk of cancer, Parkinson's disease, and birth defects. Industry wants to eliminate IRIS and they have been wanting to do this for many years because IRIS's science exposes the health harm of many of the chemical industry's products. Eliminating IRIS would not increase efficiency, it would reduce efficiency and waste taxpayer dollars. In addition, ORSD's funding has declined 47% between 2003 and 2022, while funding for research from other federal agencies has risen almost 100%, despite increasing demands for EPA science. So recent actions indicate that EPA's new leadership intends to eliminate or hollow out ORD and IRIS. Agency political leaders have told ORD's 1,400 scientists that they may apply for 400 positions in other offices, with no indication of their roles for the remaining 1,000. The loss of ORD and IRIS will undermine the development of new or updated chemical risk assessments and could lead to greater use of biased corporate science in government decision-making. To be clear, eliminating the science will not make the harms go away. The opposite will happen, as we will have no science to identify and mitigate toxic harms. Closing or minimizing EPA scientific offices will destroy decades of science that has helped to protect America's health. If Congress and the White House are serious about making America healthy, they need to protect ORD and IRIS, increase their funding, and preserve scientific independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woodruff. Mr. McLaughlin.
Thank you. Everybody deserves clean water and safe drinking water. This is the foundation of the state revolving funds, or SRF programs, funded through EPA cap grants. Ranking Member Whitehouse and members of the committee, I want to thank you for your time to testify on behalf of the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. My name is Keith McLaughlin, Executive Director for the Colorado Water and Power Authority. We manage the state SRF program. I'm also a board member and secretary of CEFA, an association representing SRFs in all 50 states. The SRFs have over 35 years of history of successfully funding critical water and wastewater projects through EPA cap grants. SRFs are primarily low-interest programs, but we use grants to targeted communities that really need them. The SRFs have taken $76 billion over that 35-year period and produced $216 billion and 63,000 water projects across the country. In other words, we're efficient. And for every $1 in federal funds, we produce $3 in projects. We focus on small, disadvantaged communities and rural communities. An example, under the Clean Water SRF program, loans go to more than half the loans go to towns of under 3,500 population. In addition, the SRFs coordinate with both EPA and state technical assistance to make sure they have the technical, managerial, and financial capacity to not only take on an SRF loan, but also so that they could run the project for the next 20 or 30 years. And this is just a few of the many reasons programs have received bipartisan support since the SRF's inception. On the water side, SRFs are fixing broken pipes and upgrading treatments to remove PFAS, radionuclides, lead and copper, and addressing harmful algal blooms. Denver Water is using SRF funds to remove lead service lines in the poorest areas of the city first. They're removing 2,100 additional lead lines per year due to SRF funding through EPA cap grants. Rhode Island also has an important SLS lead servicing line replacement program with Providence Water Supply Board. Both projects are being built at no direct cost to homeowners. Lead can cause hearing loss, high blood pressure, kidney damage, reproductive issues, and other health risks. On the wastewater side, SRFs are lining unlined and unpermitted lagoons. We're building and upgrading mechanical plants to remove ammonia and nitrates. We're building stormwater control projects and non-point source projects like riparian buffers to protect rivers from contaminated runoff. In Colorado, we're cleaning up mine tailing sites, which is now the #1 source of water pollution in the state. So what happens if the administration's budget is approved? Well, this cuts nearly 90% of the SRF funding. It essentially decimates the most successful water infrastructure program in the nation's history. Now, this threatens compliance with federal water quality and public health standards. It disproportionately harms underserved and rural communities, and it drives up costs for water users. making essential services and critical health projects less affordable, unaffordable, or in certain cases, not affordable at all. These cuts also have a real economic impact and result in 40,000 jobs lost and $6.47 billion lost in economic output nationwide. These cuts would delay or eliminate critical ongoing projects. For example, California's San Bernardino groundwater chlorination station, San Francisco's water service line replacement project. Cuts to EPA would also halt continuing SRF funding for Chesapeake Bay protection and related total maximum daily loads, or TMDL projects. The administration has suggested that the SRFs are duplicative of rural development and WIFIA in their budget request. I would state that this is not true. WIFIA can only fund 49% of projects costs and are designed for large regional projects. USDA, on the other hand, can only fund rural projects, not urban projects. Rural development also requires interim financing, which is often provided by programs like the SRF. It's also important to note that in the skinny budget, there are also cuts to funding for rural development, and recent cuts to rural development staff have further complicated matters. It has been suggested that the SRFs, because they revolve, the states no longer need CAP grants, and that water infrastructure may not be needed. Well, the answer to that question is no. Project costs are not static, and they will continue to increase due to inflation, rising infrastructure costs, and regulatory demands. Over the next 20 years, EPA estimates water infrastructure will exceed $1.25 trillion. And this is based on state-to-state surveys that account for real projects. This is a real number. The solution is to increase funding for SRFs, not to decrease them. And that's our ask, is to fund the SRFs at $6.5 billion total, or $3.25 billion for each in 2026. I want to thank you for the time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much. Let me start with a question for Ms. Allison. You said that the EPA field team had worked tirelessly, was your word, in East Palestine. Could you flesh that out a little bit for me and give me a sense of, in the immediate aftermath of the train wreck, what would a typical day look like for the EPA field team?
Sure. So I don't work for the EPA, but what I would imagine is, especially in that immediate aftermath, and what I can remember is that a typical day was, in the very beginning, very hectic, very demanding. There were so many people from the EPA field team there within hours of the disaster. So, they would start early, often before dawn, set up and maintain monitoring stations. They were monitoring water, monitoring the air, spending hours on site, expecting the cleanup efforts, and ensuring that Norfolk Southern was really following proper procedures. The thing that I was most surprised about was their involvement within the community. So they held a lot of meetings with local officials and community members to provide updates and address concerns, which was something, as a concerned mom and resident of the town, that I was most appreciative of. And we also have to remember, a couple weeks after the disaster, Administrator Regan came to town and put forth that unilateral administrative order to force Norfolk Southern to rip up the train tracks that they put all of that contaminated soil on top of to do extensive cleanup in the area.
When you said that EPA and DOJ held Norfolk Southern accountable, what are some examples of the accountability that they brought to Norfolk Southern?
Sure. So the EPA has taken a number of legal actions against Norfolk Southern in response to the East Palestine train derailment, including a settlement that's still ongoing, a unilateral administrative order, as I mentioned already, both to rip up the train tracks that were on top of the contaminated soil, and also a Clean Water Act order as well to make sure that the waterways throughout town are cleaned up too. The EPA's legal actions aim to hold Norfolk Southern responsible for those cleanup costs and ensure safety measures are implemented, and to hopefully ultimately protect the public health and the safety of the community and the environment.
Mr. Taylor, you have lived in reserve pretty much your whole life with the DuPont and now Denka chemical facility and its chloroprene emissions. What can you tell us about what chloroprene does to a human body? Use.
Chloroprene is devastating to the human body. According to the scientific agencies, NADA, IRIS, primarily, number one, most devastating is cancer. But the fact that there are so many other health issues associated with that, cardiovascular, renal, immune system. My daughter's immune system suffering from a very rare immune. 5 or 6 other local young ladies have fallen prey to this. So the chloroprene has affected our lives in ways that it was insidious. We weren't aware that that's what we were being done to by this plant. And when we discovered that, we began to see why so many people, it was just not, it wasn't, it didn't seem real to us that there could be people, agencies, who were aware of what was happening and allowed it to happen, even resisted. Once we realized this and we formed the organization and the community began to try to take efforts to protect itself, you know, agencies misled us and gave false information. And so it's been devastating on us as a community, especially the last 10 to 12 years when we really found out what it was about and set out to try to have some sort of remedies implemented. And we found out about the organized resistance to that.
I noticed about your testimony when you talked about the letter that EPA sent. And I wrote down what you said. You said the letter validated everything we had fought for. And I noticed your voice lift when you said that. Like it meant a lot to you that the EPA letter validated what you had fought for. And I noticed later on you used the term sacrifice zone. And when you used the term sacrifice zone, your voice fell, like that hurt. And I'd just like to get a response of what you kind of touched on it just now, talking about agencies that weren't out to help you, that were in your way, that were frustrating you, and leaving you in a sacrifice zone. And then here comes EPA, and it sounded like they actually took your side, and that meant a lot, not just in terms of the outcome, but in terms of you and your group at last being validated.
What EPA did with the Biden administration, I think I probably mentioned it in here. We fought for 5 or 6 years. We marched, we demonstrated. We were totally ignored. When Mr. Reagan came to reserve, I mean, that was shocking, number one. We'd been everywhere. We marched to the state capitol, and we were ignored. We rallied in front of the state capitol. All of the people, all of the officials ignored. And for the head of the EPA to actually come to reserve, our little community, you know, yeah, and I know I certainly was. And with my conversations with Mr. Reagan and him viewing for himself, seeing for himself some of the situations we were in, and he responded, especially with the Hahn ruling, because it's definitely very important for us to know what's in the air we're breathing,
Yeah.
in the water that we have to drink.
Yeah.
And with these people being licensed by the state to dump 29 chemicals into our atmosphere and into our lives, it was very frightening. And to me, the fact that our scientists here in America who work for EPA, and they, as a result of the rules and laws here, they could not enforce that. When EPA came up with the 0.2 ruling, they could not enforce it. And our government, our state government and local governments totally ignored it. So the Hahn ruling, to me, was a blessing. It was a miracle. It was the greatest gift we could have gotten, because not only could the government enforce it, they went about enabling us. They set aside funding, especially for fence line communities, to develop methodologies and means by which we ourselves could monitor our air and know what was in our air. It's frightening when I go to bed at night and I hear those sounds, because they put that plant right in the middle of our community. I hate it when I hear people say, we live in proximity to that plant. No, that plant was dumped right in the heart. They're less than 400 yards from our historic school. It's an elementary school now with 400 children, kindergarten through 5th grade, being exposed to levels what EPA says 700 times. But nobody could enforce it. So that really, when I heard the term sacrifice zone, what? In America in the 21st century, a sacrifice zone? Well, it really ensured that information that me and the rest of the group who formed this organization, that really fortified our resolve to fight these people.
Well, thank you.
And I want to thank you, sir.
Oh, my pleasure. Dr. Woodruff, you talked about the research that EPA undertakes, and I'd like to ask you a question about that in the context of incentives. Are there areas of research that EPA undertakes that the private sector, and particularly the polluting industries, have either no incentive to undertake or a perverse incentive to make sure that they don't undertake?
Sure. First of all, I want to also add that sometimes the private industry does the research and then they hide it. So for PFOA and PFOS, we know from internal industry documents that 3M and DuPont lied about the toxicity of PFOA and PFOS for decades. And it was only because of legal actions that it was uncovered, and that we now know what extensive health harms have been caused by those chemicals. So to that end, if you know...
For what it's worth, that's a common theme. Exxon knew, we've shown that, and I fought with the lead paint industry and the Lead Industries Association for years to dig out what they knew about their product.
Exactly. And so they all have they have an incentive to not tell us the truth. They have a profit incentive. Let me say the incentive is about making money off their products while we are being exposed to them and they are causing health harms. And they also have an incentive to not have the government do the research to understand what the exposures are, a profit incentive, to not do the research, to not identify the exposures, because once we know what the exposures are, like at the Danka facility and the health harms, and we only, actually really the EPA tools only tell you a fraction of what those health harms are, as the witness has said, once that happens, then those facilities must stop polluting people, or they must clean up, and that costs them money. And so I think that's why the EPA's Office of Research and Development and the IRIS program are such a huge target for the chemical industry, because they do the kind of research like the research on Gen X that was contaminating the drinking water in North Carolina that forces the industry to actually have to be responsible and or have to pay a fine for polluting, and or may have to do things that cost more money in order to make sure that we are not contaminated. And I just want to add another thing about this too, is that EPA's Office of Research and Development does research that is unique among the federal agencies. So I have had grants from US EPA. I have grants right now from the National Institute for Health and National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. They're not the same kind of grants. EPA grants actually are designed to answer questions to help both EPA and the different program offices understand and address problems that are about environmental exposures and health effects. NIH grants, even in National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, are not solution-oriented grants. They do findings that help the community, but EPA actually goes through a whole process where they both make sure the grants are scientifically rigorous, and then they go through another process to make sure that those grants meet the needs of the EPA's program offices so that they can answer key questions to do the most effective oversight, cleanup, regulation for those types of toxic chemicals.
Well said. Mr. McLaughlin, you apparently in Colorado are facing a loss of about $30 million from the proposed cuts to the state revolving fund. You also said that through the federal support of state revolving funds, for every federal dollar you get $3 worth of actual clean water infrastructure out there. So do the math for me about losing $30 million in federal funds in your state revolving fund, and how that you expect to play out through the Colorado Clean Water Program.
Thank you for the question, Senator. The math is simple. It's, $30 loss is really a $90 million hit to the program. And if you think about those funds revolving, coming back in, those are dollars that are permanently lost to the program that don't then revolve over that next 20 or 30 years. In the state of Colorado, we're facing a $1 billion deficit shortage. We're trying to hang on to the water programs we've got now and ensure that we have enough state dollars to meet the match requirements for federal dollars. So we don't have the ability to take on, these level of projects as a state. We need the federal assistance. I think without those funding, you're going to see and can expect to see, more boil orders, continuing issues of spills and contamination. The list goes on. It's going to be very difficult, I think, not just for Colorado, but for many states to try to fill that gap if the SRF funds were to be reduced by those significant dollars. Again, 90% of the funding.
And in addition to the multiplier effect around the federal dollars, in Rhode Island, we also see an expertise value that comes with this funding, because not all of our water companies are big and complicated and have their own labs and all of that. Some of our water companies are very small. I assume that's the case in Colorado communities, and particularly rural communities as well. Could you say a word about what happens when the expertise comes with the funding to help small companies that may not have that expertise in-house?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very good point. Colorado has 273 municipalities About 24 of those are of any size, and they're traditionally along the Front Range. That means the remaining communities are smaller communities that don't have those expertise. They don't have, they're only doing this project once every 30 or 40 years. And so part of what the state revolving funds funded through EPA cap grants provides, both national and state technical assistance. And I mentioned that in my 5 minutes of testimony, how critical that is. These small towns have a clerk, and Barb only works Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Fridays from noon to 4. You imagine those communities trying to take on a $20 million water treatment plant. You have to bring the expertise to them.
Yeah.
And that's what the SRFs do. We tie together with the health department and other programs, federal and state agencies, to provide that technical assistance to not only get the loan money there, but to then, again, operate those projects efficiently and effectively for the next 20 or 30 years.
Particularly with new demands like microplastics. I remember reading a report that they found microplastics in raindrops falling over Colorado. They couldn't explain what was going wrong with the rain experiment that they were doing. So they looked at and found microplastics. They weren't looking for it, but they were getting weird results with whatever they were studying. So they checked to see what was wrong. And in fact, microplastic, or nanoplastic, if you want to call it that, is now a drinking water issue, and that's a new issue. And without expertise, how on earth is a water district or a water company that has 12 employees going to deal with that without that centralized expertise?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we talked about 1,4-dioxane and PFAS, some of those forever chemicals. We're just on the cusp of that. Colorado is seeing anywhere from 10 to 20% of systems test positively for PFAS, and those are the systems that are voluntarily testing. We expect that number to go up. Microplastics, we're just on the cusp of that, and so those requirements are going to continue and will require an extreme amount of resources across to help those smaller communities, not just rural states, but all states with rural communities with their projects. It's going to be a critical piece, and has been a core piece of the SRFs since its existence.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm being beckoned by the clock to get back over to the Senate floor to catch up with the latest mischief and parliamentary intrigue that's happening to try to interfere with California's clean air rule. But this was a really terrific panel. Mr. Taylor, thank you. You were wonderful, and I congratulate you on your success and the persistence that went into all those months and years when you weren't seeing that success, but you hung in there until you got there. Ms. Allison, your experience firsthand in East Palestine is really something, and thank you for bearing witness to the EPA work in that sudden emergency. Dr. Woodruff, you're as good at explaining what's up in EPA research as anyone, and you were very helpful today. And Mr. McLaughlin, thank you, because there's a lot to the resources that we put into local water systems, a lot more than just throwing money down the pipe. So you've helped make that clear. In a different world, this would have been a committee hearing, and there would have been a lot of bipartisanship about listening to you and acting to solve the very real problems that you have very clearly described. It's only in our current weird world where that can't take place, and the only people that get listened to are the polluters, at least the polluters with the biggest pockets. So I'm really happy with what you've done. I'm really proud of your testimony, and I just wish we could offer you a better Washington to have it land with more of an impact. But you did have an impact, and I'm grateful to you, and I thank you.